The Ideal of Human Unity, Chapter 35, Summary and Conclusion. In other words, and this is the conclusion at which we arrive, while it is possible to construct a precarious and quite mechanical unity by political and administrative means, the unity of the human race, even if achieved, can only be secured and can only be made real if the religion of humanity, which is at present the highest active ideal of mankind, spiritualizes itself and becomes the general inner law of human life. The outward unity may well achieve itself, possibly, though by no means certainly, in a measurable time, because that is the inevitable final trend of the working of nature in human society, which makes for larger and yet larger aggregations, and cannot fail to arrive at a total aggregation of mankind in a closer international system. This working of nature depends for its means of fulfillment upon two forces, which combine to make the larger aggregation inevitable. First, there is the increasing closeness of common interests, or at least the interlacing and interrelation of interests in a larger and yet larger circle, which makes old divisions an obstacle and a cause of weakness, obstruction, and friction, and the clash and collision that comes out of this friction a ruinous calamity to all, even to the victor, who has to pay a too heavy price for his gains. And even these expected gains, as war becomes more complex and disastrous, are becoming more and more difficult to achieve, and the success problematical. An increasing perception of this community or interrelation of interests, and a growing unwillingness to face the consequences of collision and ruinous struggle, must push men to welcome any means for mitigating the divisions which lead to such disasters. If the trend to the mitigation of divisions is once given a definite form, that commences an impetus which drives towards closer and closer union. If she cannot arrive by these means, if the incoherence is too great for the trend of unification to triumph, nature will use other means, such as war and conquest, or the temporary domination of the powerful state or empire, or the menace of such a domination, which will compel those threatened to adopt a closer system of union. It is these means, and this force of outward necessity, which she used to create nation units and national empires, and however modified in the circumstances and workings, it is at bottom the same force and the same means, which she is using to drive mankind towards international unification. But secondly, there is the force of a common uniting sentiment. This may work in two ways. It may come before as an originating or contributory cause, or it may come afterwards as a cementing result. In the first case, the sentiment of a larger unity springs up among units, which were previously divided, and leads them to seek after a form of union which may then be brought about principally by the force of the sentiment and its idea, or by that secondarily as an aid to other and more outward events and causes. We may note that in earlier times this sentiment was insufficiently effective. As among the petty clan or regional nations, unity had ordinarily to be effected by outward circumstances, and generally by the grossest of them, by war and conquest, by the domination of the most powerful among the many warring or contiguous peoples. But in later times, the force of the sentiment of unity, supported as it has been by a clearer political idea, has become more effective. The larger national aggregates have grown up by a simple act of federation or union, though this has sometimes had to be preceded by a common struggle for liberty or a union in war against a common enemy. So have grown into one the United States, Italy, Germany, and more peacefully the Australian and South African federations. But in other cases, especially in the earlier national aggregations, the sentiment of unity has grown up largely or entirely as the result of the formal, outward, or mechanical union. But whether to form or to preserve the growth of the sentiment, the psychological factor is indispensable. Without it, there can be no secure and lasting union. Its absence, the failure to create such a sentiment, or to make it sufficiently living, natural, forcible, has been the cause of precariousness of such aggregates as Austro-Hungary and of the ephemeral character of the empires of the past, even as it is likely to bring about, unless circumstances change, the collapse or disintegration of the great present-day empires. The trend of forces towards some kind of international world organization, eventuating in a possible far-off unification, which is now just beginning to declare itself as an idea or aspiration, though the causes which made it inevitable have been for some time at work, is enforced by the pressure of need and environment, by outward circumstances. At the same time, there is a sentiment helped and stimulated by these outward circumstances, a cosmopolitan, international sentiment, still rather nebulous and vaguely ideal, which may accelerate the growth of the formal union. In itself, this sentiment would be an insufficient cement for the preservation of any mechanical union which might be created, for it could not easily be so close and forcible a sentiment as national feeling. It would have to subsist on the conveniences of union as its only substantial provender. But the experience of the past shows that this mere necessity of convenience is, in the end, not strong enough to resist the pressure of unfavorable circumstances and the reassertion of old or the effective growth of new centrifugal forces. There is, however, at work a more powerful force, a sort of intellectual religion of humanity, clear in the minds of the few, vaguely felt in its effects and its disguises by the many, which has largely helped to bring about much of the trend of the modern mind and the drift of its developing institutions. This is a psychological force, which tends to break beyond the formula of the nation, and aspires to replace the religion of country, and even, in its more extreme forms, to destroy altogether the national sentiment, and to abolish its divisions so as to create the single nation of mankind. We may say, then, that this trend must eventually realize itself, however great may be the difficulties. And they are really enormous, much greater than those which attended the national formation. If the present unsatisfactory condition of international relations should lead to a series of cataclysms, either large and world-embracing like the present war, or, though each more limited in scope, yet in their sum world-pervading and necessarily, by the growing interrelation of interests, affecting even those who do not fall directly under their touch, then mankind will finally be forced in self-defense to a new, closer, and more stringently unified order of things. Its choice will be between that and a lingering suicide. If the human reason cannot find out the way, nature herself is sure to shape these upheavals in such a way as to bring about her end. Therefore, whether soon or in the long run, whether brought about by its own growing sentiment of unity, stimulated by common interest and convenience, or by the evolutionary pressure of circumstances, we may take it that an eventual unification, or at least some formal organization of human life on earth, is the incalculable being always allowed for, practically inevitable. I have tried to show, from the analogy of the past evolution of the nation, that this international unification must culminate, is likely to culminate, in one of two forms. There is likely to be either a centralized world state or a looser world union, which may be either a close federation or a simple confederacy of the peoples for the common ends of mankind. The last form is the most desirable, because it gives sufficient scope for the principle of variation, which is necessary for the free play of life and the healthy progress of the race. The process by which the world state may come starts with the creation of a central body, which will at first have very limited functions, but, once created, must absorb by degrees all the different utilities of a centralized international control. As the state, first in the form of a monarchy and then of a parliament, has been absorbing by degrees the whole control of the life of the nation, so that we are now within measurable distance of a centralized socialistic state, which will leave no part of the life of its individuals unregulated. A similar process in the world state will end in the taking up and the regulation of the whole life of the peoples into its hands. It may even end by abolishing national individuality and turning the divisions that it has created into mere departmental groupings, provinces, and districts of the one common state. Such an eventuality may seem now a fantastic dream or an unrealizable idea, but it is one which, under certain conditions, that are by no means beyond the scope of ultimate possibility may well become feasible and even, after a certain point is reached, inevitable. A federal system, and still more a confederacy, would mean, on the other hand, the preservation of the national basis and a greater or less freedom of national life. But the subordination of the separate national to the larger common interests and of full separate freedom to the greater international necessities. It may be questioned whether past analogies are a safe guide in a problem so new, and whether something else might not be evolved more intimately and independently, arising from it, and suitable to its complexities. But mankind, even in dealing with its new problems, works upon past experience, and therefore upon past motives and analogies. Even when it seizes on new ideas, it goes to the past for the form it gives to them. Behind the apparent changes of the most radical revolutions, we see this unavoidable principle of continuity surviving in the heart of the new order. Moreover, these alternatives seem the only way in which the two forces in presence can work out their conflict, either by the disappearance of the one, the separative national instinct, or by an accommodation between them. On the other hand, it is quite possible that human thought and action may take so new a turn as to bring in a number of unforeseen possibilities and lead to a quite different ending. And one might, upon these lines, set one's imagination to work, and produce perhaps a utopia of a better kind. Such constructive efforts of the human imagination have their value, and often a very great value, but any such speculations would evidently have been out of place in the study I have attempted. Neither of the two alternatives and none of the three forms considered are free from serious objections. A centralized world state would signify the triumph of the idea of mechanical unity, or rather of uniformity. It would inevitably mean the undue depression of an indispensable element in the vigor of human life and progress, the free life of the individual, the free variation of the peoples. It must end if it becomes permanent and fulfills all its tendencies, either in a death in life, a stagnation, or by the insurgence of some new saving but revolutionary force or principle which would shatter the whole fabric into pieces. The mechanical tendency is one to which the logical reason of man, itself a precise machine, is easily addicted, and its operations are obviously the easiest to manage and the most ready to hand. Its full evolution may seem to the reason desirable, necessary, inevitable, but its end is predestined. A centralized, socialistic state may be a necessity of the future, once it is founded, but a reaction from it will be equally an eventual necessity of the future. The greater its pressure, the more certainly will it be met by the spread of the spiritual, the intellectual, the vital, and practical principle of anarchism, in revolt against that mechanical pressure. so too a centralized, mechanical world state must rouse in the end a similar force against it, and might well terminate in a crumbling up and disintegration, even in the necessity for a repetition of the cycle of humanity, ending in a better attempt to solve the problem. It could be kept in being only if humanity agreed to allow all the rest of its life to be regularized for it for the sake of peace and stability, and took refuge for its individual freedom in the spiritual life, as happened once under the Roman Empire. But even that would be only a temporary solution. A federal system also would tend inevitably to establish one general type for human life, institutions, and activities. It would allow only a play of minor variations. But the need of variation in living nature could not always rest satisfied with that scanty sustenance. On the other hand, a looser confederacy might well be open to the objection that it would give too ready a handle for centrifugal forces, were such to arise in new strength. A loose confederation could not be permanent. It must turn in one direction or the other, end either in a close and rigid centralization, or at last by a breakup of the loose unity into its original elements. The saving power needed is a new psychological factor, which will at once make a united life necessary to humanity and force it to respect the principle of freedom. The religion of humanity seems to be the one growing force which tends in that direction, for it makes for the sense of human oneness. It has the idea of the race, and yet, at the same time, it respects the human individual and the natural human grouping. But its present intellectual form seems hardly sufficient. The idea, powerful in itself and in its effects, is yet not powerful enough to mold the whole life of the race in its image. For it has to concede too much to the egoistic side of human nature, once all and still 9/10 of our being, with which its larger idea is in conflict. On the other side, because it leans principally on the reason, it turns too readily to the mechanical solution. For the rational idea ends always as a captive of its machinery, becomes a slave of its own too-binding process. A new idea, with another turn of the logical machine, revolts against it and breaks up its machinery, but only to substitute in the end another mechanical system, another credo, formula, and practice. A spiritual religion of humanity is the hope of the future. But this is not meant what is ordinarily called a universal religion, a system, a thing of creed and intellectual belief and dogma and outward rite. Mankind has tried unity by that means. It has failed and deserved to fail, because there can be no universal religious system, one in mental creed and vital form. The inner spirit is indeed one, but more than any other, the spiritual life insists on freedom and variation in its self-expression and means of development. A religion of humanity means the growing realization that there is a secret spirit, a divine reality, in which we are all one, that humanity is its highest present vehicle on earth, that the human race and the human being are the means by which it will progressively reveal itself here. It implies a growing attempt to live out this knowledge and bring about a kingdom of this divine spirit upon earth. By its growth within us, oneness with our fellow men will become the leading principle of all our life, not merely a principle of cooperation, but a deeper brotherhood, a real and an inner sense of unity and equality, and a common life. There must be the realization by the individual that only in the life of his fellow men is his own life complete. There must be the realization by the race that only on the free and full life of the individual can its own perfection and permanent happiness be founded. There must be, too, a discipline and a way of salvation in accordance with this religion. That is to say, a means by which it can be developed by each man within himself, so that it may be developed in the life of the race. To go into all that this implies would be too large a subject to be entered upon here. It is enough to point out that in this direction lies the eventual road. No doubt, if this is only an idea, like the rest, it will go the way of all ideas. But if it is at all a truth of our being, then it must be the truth to which all is moving, and in it must be found the means of a fundamental, an inner, a complete, a real human unity, which would be the one secure base of a unification of human life, a spiritual oneness which would create a psychological oneness, not dependent upon any intellectual or outward uniformity, and compel a oneness of life not bound up with its mechanical means of unification, but ready always to enrich its secure unity by a free inner variation and a freely varied outer self-expression. This would be the basis for a higher type of human existence. Could such a realization develop rapidly in mankind, we might then solve the problem of unification in a deeper and truer way, from the inner truth to the outer forms. Until then, the attempt to bring it about by mechanical means must proceed. But the higher hope of humanity lies in the growing number of men who will realize this truth and seek to develop it in themselves, so that when the mind of man is ready to escape from its mechanical bent, perhaps when it finds that its mechanical solutions are all temporary and disappointing, the truth of the Spirit may step in and lead humanity to the path of its highest possible happiness and perfection.